And for some analysis of the major challenges facing China's incoming leadership, I'm joined by Professor Bates Gill, the CEO of the US Studies Centre, and Dr. John Lee from the Centre for International Security Studies with the University of Sydney. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
John Lee, if I could just start with you, how do you see the legacy of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao playing out in history? Were they visionaries or were they just beneficiaries of a world hungry for Chinese exports?
Well, in the short term, I think the legacy will be positive because China achieved rapid growth for the whole time that they were in power. But if you look beyond or beneath the high growth rates, I think the real story over the last 10 years has been the advance of the state-owned sector in the Chinese economy and a retreat of the private sector. Now, that is behind many of the structural problems that we're seeing in China today. If those reforms are not undertaken by the next generation, I think the Hu-Wen leadership team may not look so strong when their legacy is written up in a few years' time. So,
John Lee, you're saying that you don't think that Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao laid the groundwork to strengthen China's economy in the future?
Well, their top priority was to achieve rapid growth. So they've done that. That's a tick in the box. But the question is still, how did they achieve rapid growth? It was largely through support of the state corporate sector at the expense of the private sector, and it was largely through not so much net investments, but more recently fixed investment. And every Chinese economist now agrees that the fixed investment model needs to be reformed and it's not sustainable.
Bates Gill, assuming that Xi Jinping will be the next president, we know that he suffered greatly during the Cultural Revolution. He's of the younger generation. What sort of leader will he be?
Well, he's a big unknown still to a lot of persons. We want to believe that he came out of a background that's going to be more open to reform processes, but there are a lot of aspects of his background which might weigh against that. He will probably be an even weaker leader than was Hu Jintao, requiring a great deal of consensus building around any major undertakings.
Is that because there's some factional infighting?
Well, there is factionalism, of course, within the Chinese system, but it's more that a person of his background and abilities thus far, as we know, is not going to be one of these bold leaders like Deng Xiaoping or even like Jiang Zemin. The problem that the leadership today faces, and is certainly going to lead going forward, isn't so much at maintaining the growth. That won't be a major problem. We saw the recent statistics there that we can expect good growth from China going forward. It's the problem. It's the problems that the growth creates for China, not least corruption, this concentration of resources within the state-owned system, which John just mentioned. These are huge, ultimately sclerotic problems which the Chinese system is going to face. I think the legacy of the Hu-Wen leadership actually, while it's maybe good in terms of growth, they did very little to address the socioeconomic challenges of the country.
What about, I guess, the regime as its openness to the media and to the West, so to speak? I think it was quite interesting to note that they did hold a press conference on Friday for admittedly invited journalists. However, it was hijacked by journalists from Hong Kong. In Hu's time, he only had one press conference, and that was just prior to the Olympics. Do you think that's quite interesting?
Well, at that level of Hu Jintao, yes, it's probably rare to expect him to be engaging openly with the press. But as a general rule, the Chinese system has become far more open to at least various types of press engagement, but usually at a somewhat lower level. I mean, there's weekly press opportunities, for example, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. All the major ministries have these press opportunities, controlled as they sometimes are, not the sort of free-for-all you can sometimes see in Western democracies. But it has become relatively more open, if not at the senior-most level.
John Lee, do you see that happening too? I mean, we did see this story about Google having problems over the weekend.
I think it's a reminder that the Chinese Communist Party isn't this all-powerful entity that rules over the country like it was during Mao's time. Of course, they still have exclusive hold on political power, but they do have to manage the modern press. They do have to manage their reputations. They do need a public relations strategy. And I think you're seeing that with the rise of traditional press, but particularly online press, that is just a CCP responding to modern reality.
There's also been commentary, John Lee, about Xi Jinping potentially introducing a Singapore-based model of government to sort of overtake what we've seen in the past. What's your view on that?
I don't really think it's possible for a number of reasons. First of all, Singapore is a small city-state of a few million. China, of course, is a massive country of 1.4 billion people. The second thing is that Singapore always had the advantages of good institutions. It's an extremely corrupt-free country. It rates extremely highly in all these indices. It's got things like property rights. It's got things like independent courts when it isn't to do with political issues. China doesn't have all those things. So I don't really think that China can follow that Singapore model. I think the CCP would love to because it means they could remain in power, but the two countries are just so dissimilar.
Bates Gill, what's your view on that?
I doubt that Xi Jinping will have an opportunity, actually, to move very far down the path to any sort of more open, pluralistic government form. One of the other big challenges he faces going forward is that his two predecessors are still alive, still very active politically, and will still be working hard to assure that their legacy, their friends, their family would be protected and secure under any new system of governance that might unfold. And it's just too dangerous, I would say, for those people and their families and their cronies to see the country become truly more open.
And Bates Gill, the other issue at play here is the growing interdependence between China and the United States. Now that we know that President Obama is in for another 4 terms, how do you see the whole Sino-US relations playing out?
Well, it is probably a good thing that there is a continuation on the American side. That's going to lead to some greater confidence within the relationship overall. But that said, over the past 2 or 3 years, I would say the U.S.-China relationship has become more fraught with tension. The extent of strategic mistrust between these two countries has probably worsened over that period. China, rightly or wrongly, is concerned about the so-called American pivot or rebalancing to Asia. The United States is concerned about what is seen there as an increasingly assertive China, a less cooperative China. I don't predict this is going to devolve into confrontation or conflict, but I think it's going to be at least another year until the new leadership is well in place in China, more confident, and then would seek to re-engage with the United States and hopefully bring about some improvement to the relationship.
Well, just on that point of conflict, China's Commerce Minister Chen Deming has recently said that the potential for a trade war with the US is there. Let's just take a look at what he had to say over the weekend.
Someone asked me, are you entering a trade war with the United States just like this? I said, no. I hope we can sit down and discuss and try our best not to get involved in a trade war. But I must say, when others attack our businesses and invade our interests, I have to protect our businesses.
So, John Lee, I'll go to you. Given the anti-China sentiment in the US that we recently saw during the election campaign, is there a potential, do you see a serious potential for a trade war?
The potential's always there, but I don't think a serious trade war will occur for the simple reason that it's not in the interest of both the United States or China for that to happen. You take the American side, for example, and the Americans go on about the Chinese currency, which they say is too low. Now, I agree that the Chinese currency is probably artificially suppressed, but one of the great beneficiaries of a low Chinese currency are American consumers, simply because goods are cheaper for the American population. So it's not a simple zero-sum game between those two countries. And I think if you do the analysis, the way China encourages export manufacturing in a country is actually good for Western consumers. I think the American economists know that, so I don't see the prospect of a trade war deepening, in my view.
Bates Gill, what's your view on China's monetary policy with yuan? Do you see that they will free up the yuan?
I would doubt it. I mean, in many respects, for the reasons which John just noted, the fact that by maintaining the currency at the level they have, allows for, hopefully, for them to be more active in driving forward their continued export-led growth. It's interesting that in spite of enormous political and economic pressure within the United States over the last 4 years, the Obama administration has been very firm and has not gone forward with the currency manipulator steps, which Governor Romney said he would do on day one. So that in itself, I think, is a signal that the Obama administration does not wish to engage into sort of a devolutionary economically challenging environment with the Chinese to do the best they can to avoid it.
Now, on that privatisation issue, John, that you raised at the beginning, that there's been an increase of state-owned entities and lessening of privatisation. There have been calls from the central government for economic and market reforms, and also academic Pradeep Tangia from the University of Melbourne has said this morning that there needs to be more privatisation. Let's just take a look at what he said.
There is clearly a need for economic reforms. The reforms have kind of got stuck. There is a kind of reform fatigue in China. So there are some who are articulating a position that there should be further marketization. For example, the state-owned banks, the four big banks, that they should be reformed, that there should be further privatization, for example.
John Lee, so how do you see this evolving?
Well, the real problem is that SOE interests are very firmly entrenched within the Chinese Communist Party. So you could say that SOEs now form a major, almost faction within the Chinese Communist Party, and they obviously will not want their privileges diluted. So it's a problem of political will. If you speak to Chinese economists, they all agree what needs to be done. And the privatization of many sectors in the Chinese economy is closely linked to this goal of raising domestic consumption, because the more you support private firms, the more opportunities you give a larger group of people to benefit from economic growth. That's quite clear, but it's that vested interest element, and the political will, as far as I can see, just simply isn't there right now to reform.
Bates Gill, what's your view on that?
I would very much agree. If anything, the Hu One legacy is one that saw the concentration of both political and financial power into the hands of state-owned entities, whether corporations or, even worse, individuals who are related to them. I think, 10 or 15 years ago, the sort of common wisdom was, well, China's a corrupt country, but it's typically at a localized level where you have sort of petty bureaucrats trying to extract rents out of their citizenry, but it doesn't extend up to the very top. We now know that that's not true, and that it is extending up to the very top. And this is a really big problem. How do you extract the state from its economic activity when to do so means that the very leaders themselves would not benefit from that? In fact, it might even turn on them in very bad ways, as it has, for example, with Bo Xilai. So it would take a real courageous politician in China to try and break this enmeshment of the state-owned enterprises in the political process. And I don't think we see that coming anytime soon.
Gentlemen, we're to time. John Lee, Bates Gill, thanks for joining the program.
Thank you.
My pleasure.